Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. My name is Daniel McAdams, your host. Dr. Paul is traveling today, so I will be at the helm. Today's big news, of course, is the Mueller Report. Attorney General Barr has released the report with some redactions to the public. A less redacted or unredacted version will be available to some members of Congress who were complaining about redactions. It is the big news today. Everyone's talking about it. Essentially, from Attorney General Barr's briefing this morning, we see that his 4-page summary was about right. It got it about right. No collusion between the president's campaign staff or any other American with the Russians to change the elections, to attempt to interfere with the elections, the 2016 elections that elected Donald Trump as president. Will Russiagate die? Well, today we're going to look at a few topics based on that. First of all, Trump's doing a victory lap. He already put out a tweet with a picture of him saying game over for the report. The Democrats, of course, are grasping at straws. Barr is handling this in a politicized fashion, a number of other things, but they are seeing their room for maneuver diminishing. We're going to talk about what does this mean for U.S.-Russia relations. Is Russiagate over? Don't count on it. Then we're going to talk about other areas of U.S. conflict with Russia, Latin America, Venezuela, regime change, Cuba, Nicaragua. Will the neocons actually be emboldened by Trump's victory over charges of collusion with Russia? We're going to be joined by a good friend of mine. She's a journalist. She's a documentary filmmaker. She's now working with Max Blumenthal's The Gray Zone Project, which I highly recommend for great investigative journalism. She was previously the host of RT America's In Question. She worked with Abby Martin, who does great anti-war work. So happy to invite my friend Anya Parampil to join us today on the show. Anya, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Daniel. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, it's great to talk to you. Now, we've seen a little bit about, of course, we haven't read those 400 pages yet. There's not enough coffee for that first thing in the morning, but we have a sense of what it's about. No real shocks from the 4-page summary. What's your take on the Mueller report?
I'm not surprised, much like you, that the Mueller report, it appears, at least from what I've been able to read so far, confirms the 4-page brief released by Barr just a few weeks ago, which confirms again what we thought all along, that there would be no evidence presented that the Russian government colluded with the Trump administration or the Trump campaign to put Donald Trump in office. But I'll be interested, what I'll be looking for is what exactly is redacted in the report, because I, for one, am interested to see what Mueller found regarding not Russian meddling in U.S. Electoral systems, but Israel. For example, the phone call National Security Advisor Michael Flynn had with Russian Ambassador Kislyak, which was the subject of much reporting regarding Russiagate, wasn't a phone call which demonstrated the Trump administration was being influenced by Russia, but it actually showed National Security Advisor Flynn, before the Trump administration had been inaugurated, on the phone with Kislyak, the Russian ambassador here in Washington, pressuring the Russians to veto a resolution at the UN condemning illegal Israeli settlement activity in the West Bank. So what we actually had was Michael Flynn acting on behalf of pressure from the Israeli government via Jared Kushner to influence the Russians. And I think the irony of this is lost on a lot of the reporters who claim to be paying so much attention to Russiagate. So I'll be curious what we learn regarding that phone call. But the report aside, the content of the report aside, I think it is important to recognize here that in many ways, Russiagate did achieve its intended outcome. And when I say that, it's because I believe there were two primary driving forces behind the Russiagate investigation, two separate interests. One was that of the Democratic Party elite and establishment who sought to cover for the fact they lost to Donald Trump by running a very weak campaign. and shifting the blame to Russia, saying somehow the tentacles of Putin were able to reach across the Atlantic and change the outcome of the U.S. election. That was one side of Russiagate. Another goal of Russiagate, I think, was driven by the national security establishment here in Washington, what some call the deep state. These are the figures which make up the State Department, CIA, military departments here. And their goal was to put a check on Donald Trump because he came into office promising to pursue better relations with Russia, talking about reaching a deal with Kim Jong-un and achieving some sort of peace with North Korea. These were very threatening promises made by the president to these elites in the national security state, what my friend Gareth Porter, investigative journalist Gareth Porter, describes as the permanent war state. And I think those people were successful in putting a check on the president and in many ways sabotaging his attempts to meet with Putin and have some sort of breakthrough with Russia, because as he rightly says, there's no reason for the United States and Russia to be so at odds in this way. And successfully through Russiagate, we saw a more independent thinker like Michael Flynn removed from the National Security Council and eventually replaced with John Bolton, one of the most infamous war hawks, someone who stands against everything President Trump ran on.
So in that sense, actually, the coup against Trump was successful, not a failure, even as he's taking his victory lap. That's a great point, Anya. And, the president did run on an anti-war, essentially an anti-war, anti-interventionist more than that campaign, and that is kryptonite to Washington, D.C., which, as you know, makes its living off war. That's why it's a wealthy city. It makes its living, unfortunately, off the backs of the working class and the middle class and the rest of the country to live very well off of threats and war. And as we know, the, quote, war on terror was winding down. It was winding down in the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan. They needed a new bogeyman, and that's what they got, Russia and China. So they had to create this narrative around that. It's a very good point. One of the things you probably saw the memo from the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. This is Ray McGovern and Phil Giraldi and other great intelligence professionals. They sent a memo to President Trump. I think it was yesterday or the day before. I think which made very good points. They were warning him that yes, the Mueller report may exonerate you, but the central themes of Russiagate remain, and in fact, they are reinforced by the Mueller report. And these are three things: the Internet Research Agency in Russia, which is said to have released an army of bots to influence the campaign; the so-called GRU hack of the Democratic National Committee, and also we can even add essentially the National Intelligence Assessment that was put together by John Brennan, who perfectly encapsulates what you're saying about the national security state having a coup against the president. He put this together with admittedly hand-picked analysts that wasn't vetted by the intelligence community. Essentially what it was meant to do was to knock RT out of the picture, which essentially, to a degree, it has done. So,
right.
Yeah, exactly. So here it is that the essence of Russiagate remains, even as Trump himself is exonerated.
That's absolutely true. The Democrats, ironically, are the ones who failed by banking on the Russiagate narrative. I believe, in many ways, the Democrats and the media, particularly MSNBC and CNN, as many people have pointed out, handed Trump a gift with Russiagate and honing in on this narrative all for the entirety of his presidency thus far, because now he has space to really hammer them on the campaign, the 2020 campaign. I think he's in better shape to take them on, especially considering they're in a political crisis on their own within the Democratic establishment. But when it comes to the national security apparatus, the national security state and the permanent war state, they are the victors with this narrative. And unfortunately, I think the VIP's memo will fall on deaf ears when it comes to the president, because at this point, I think he just wants to stay in power, and he's essentially agreed to play ball with the very people he was claiming to oppose early on, which is why principled anti-war thinkers like yourself and Dr. Paul never really bought into Trump's anti-war rhetoric, though you can't blame the American people for being excited about someone coming on the debate stage and saying the Iraq war was a mistake and maybe we shouldn't be running these endless interventions. But look at Syria, for example. The president attempted to announce a withdrawal there, and he was sabotaged by his own national security team, John Bolton. So you can say for a certain amount of time that the president had these genuine goals, but we have to also hold him responsible for putting Bolton in that position. And we have to ask, why hasn't he looked Bolton in the eyes yet and said, you're fired?
That's a great point. And indeed, and not only Syria, but North Korea. You know, he
Yes.
at the last minute, he basically throws a bomb at the middle of the table, and Trump doesn't know what happened. Hey, well, my friend's leaving. What's going on?
I know.
I thought we were having
It's
a good
shocking.
time. But, you know, so the central theme remains, and I would say that, well, almost what we see is, it sort of reminds me of 1989 in Romania. You know, the Iliescu coup against Ceausescu was really to keep the system in power, to keep the nomenclatura, to keep the elites in power, not to change the system. And I almost think that's kind of what we have. It's a bit esoteric, but with the Russiagate thing, you were going to sacrifice the Trump colluded thing. That was falling apart. Sacrifice that in the name of the greater good, which is retaining Russia as an enemy, selling all those weapons overseas, confronting Russia in Poland, etc. Mm-hmm. So it seems like that is really the goal.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was in Helsinki for the Trump-Putin summit just last year when there was so much hope that there actually could be a breakthrough in relations. And look where we are now. John Bolton's national security advisor, the United States withdrew from the INF treaty, a decades-old Cold War-era treaty aimed at curbing the development of dangerous weapons. And so and as you mentioned, Korea, the failure of the Trump administration to reach a deal with Kim Jong-un also makes us less safe. So that's been the only outcome of Russiagate as far as I'm concerned, along with what you also mentioned, the silencing in many ways of Russian media, RT, which we know was a central threat to the national security state, as they admitted essentially through their ODNI report, which focused the narrative of Russian collusion on RT and Russian media programming for pointing out that Wall Street is greedy or that there are third parties in the United States beyond the one-party establishment. I should say there are more than one party, because essentially that's all we have between the Democrats and the Republicans at the moment.
Yeah, they're the enemy for letting renegades like me and you talk about peace and
Yes.
about people getting ripped off. Let's move over to another area of U.S.-Russia conflict, essentially a proxy war in Latin America. And this is an area that you know very well. And in fact, one of the reasons I wanted to chat with you, we got heavy into the Mueller Report because everyone's talking about it, but you were in Venezuela earlier this year. You've been on the ground. That's my kind of journalist, by the way, who goes to these places and talks to people rather than repeating the talking points. Now, we're seeing that the U.S. coup, well, Venezuela is only the start. Bolton already said that. That's just an appetizer. We've got Cuba and Nicaragua to deal with. But Venezuela's not going that great. They still have those 84 countries, and even those are wavering a little bit. Maybe you give us a flavor of what you saw on the ground, what your sense was on the ground, and update us on what's happening with IMF. There's the OAS recent meeting. Just bring us up to date on that if you can.
Sure. It's impossible to separate, as you say, the tension the United States or the national security state is driving with Russia and what's going on in Venezuela. And I'll tell you why. I believe the primary reason the figures within the permanent war state who we've been talking about despise Russia so much, despite the fact that Trump makes a lot of sense when he says there's no, real clear point of tension, the Cold War is over. It's because Russia has been, since the war in Syria, the primary check on U.S. empire. And that's because after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States, they thought, we heard all about the end of history and that the United States would now be able to, pursue its interests worldwide without any sort of counterbalance. And so we saw disastrous regime change wars in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, because Russia was in a weak position then. It wasn't in a state where it could effectively oppose the United States. But that changed in Syria, where the Russian military intervention was pivotal in allowing the Syrian government to resist a real violent attempt to overthrow its government by U.S.-backed extremists, right-wing Islamic extremist groups. And that really pissed people off in Washington. And now we're seeing it happen again in Venezuela, which is a different case because the Trump administration, rather than try and wage a regime change war, just threw all of its cards out on the table immediately and recognized some random figure in the Venezuelan National Assembly as president, someone 1 out of 5 Venezuelans didn't even know who he was when they made this declaration. And once again, Russia's support for the Venezuelan government is sending a very clear message to Washington that it can't continue this policy or at least escalate it in the way it might wish. We are seeing Russian military advisors, Russian military planes being sent to Venezuela to send a message to the United States that Russia will stand by the legitimate government, the internationally recognized government in Caracas. And again, people, that's why you see this panic among John Bolton and Marco Rubio on Twitter saying that the Russians need to get out of Venezuela with, no sense of irony that they would only rather see their military in control. So this, I think, is the central piece driving tension between Russia and the United States. Russia is now a check on U.S. empire. So now let's look at the situation in Venezuela. It's very different than what happened in Syria because there wasn't even any sort of popular movement against the Maduro government when the United States attempted this coup. There was no protest energy, anything that they could kind of ride in and off the backs of to put this individual Juan Guaido in power. And so the coup has backfired because, as you say, I was there for 3 weeks, and what I saw is just, it won't shock people to hear, but the fact that the mainstream media in this country and our government is lying to us about what's happening there. There's no humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. I've reported from the Gaza Strip. I've witnessed a humanitarian crisis firsthand, which, by the way, is enabled by U.S. support for the Israeli government. So we're somehow supposed to believe that the same people supporting that government in Israel overseeing a humanitarian catastrophe and siege in the Gaza Strip, now we're supposed to believe those people care so much about the population of Venezuela and the humanitarian crisis they're experiencing allegedly there. And so it doesn't really make sense to me just at the beginning. But once I saw firsthand that there was no crisis on the level people here are led to believe, there is an economic crisis. People are, while there's food on the shelves, that's what people have to understand. You can go to Venezuela and you can find the goods you need. The problem is the buying power of the average Venezuelan has been severely damaged by U.S. sanctions, financial terrorism, economic war the United States has been waging against Venezuela since the Obama administration. We have to remember this all began when President Obama declared Venezuela to be a national security threat, absurdly, back in March of 2015, and introduced sanctions. Since then, and along with the collapse of oil prices in 2014, 2015, which we can also talk about how the United States may have played a role in that. As a result of those two factors, the oil price collapse and U.S. economic warfare, people are suffering. But what we have to understand about Venezuela is that there is a very sophisticated political education which took place in that country. Average Venezuelans will come up to me on the street when they found out I was a U.S. citizen. They would say, please tell the American public we love them, we respect them, we admire them, and we just want that same level of respect and independence. Please pressure your government to end the economic war that's being waged against us, because they can identify that as the root cause of their problem, not the Maduro government. As much as the United States would like to create this crisis, as Mike Pompeo said with regard to Iran, he said that U.S. sanctions would hurt the economy so much that the people would rise up to change their government. I mean, they're nakedly discussing the goal of their policy. This can't happen so easily in Venezuela because the people there really understand they are a target of U.S. empire. They talk about imperialism in a way that I wish the U.S. public could start to understand. I think people would be very impressed if they heard this. So they would come up to me and say, please tell the U.S. public that we will fight and die to defend this country. And that's what we've seen to be true. The Venezuelan military has stood by its constitution and defended the legitimate government. And Marco Rubio is so desperate. John Bolton is so desperate. They're tweeting at the defense secretary and saying that he needs to switch, and saying that soldiers need to essentially become traitors to their own country. It's absolutely absurd.
I mean, it is ironic. I mean, I tweet because I don't have any power. They have power, and they're still over there tweeting desperately. The other aspect of the Venezuela thing, I think, is a psyop against us, and it really is the weaponization of words. Because you even have some people who call themselves libertarians saying, okay, that's enough. We got to go in there. There's so much suffering. It's the worst thing on earth. And this word that has been weaponized is the word socialism. And you and I may differ in our economic and political values, what have you, but this is something separate. This is the use of a word, the weaponization of a word to cause people to cause Americans to jump up and do what they're asked. Now, Paul Craig Roberts, who nobody would accuse of being a commie, he had a piece out yesterday, I think it was, where he said, okay, so the Venezuelan government has decided to use its oil revenue to raise the living standard of the poorest in the society. So what? What's the big deal? But the way it's sold over here, as if this somehow presents a national security threat to the United States, it's just bizarre.
I'm so glad you brought up socialism and the way it's been weaponized in this war the Trump administration is waging against Venezuela, because what Mr. Roberts said there is totally true. That is in essence the core of the Venezuelan state, the fact that its major resources, which are some of the richest in the world, it has the largest oil reserves in the world, lots of gold, minerals, other things U.S. companies would like to get their hands on. When we say Venezuela is socialist, it means those resources are nationalized, sold on the market, and the government then uses that money to invest in the people. Bolton and Rubio claim that they use this money to enrich themselves, but while I was in Venezuela, I saw firsthand, again, the benefits the system has brought to the average people. They get, for example, food delivered to them to over 6 million homes twice a month now, for free, essentially, provided by the government through the CLAP program. So this is the kind of investment the government makes with its money. Since Chavez took power in '98, over the next decade or so, poverty and extreme poverty were halved, and this was the result of socialism. But the economy overall in Venezuela isn't actually socialist. 2/3 of it is still free market, capitalist run. And, when you go into the grocery store or buy anything in the street, it's from a private business. So it's difficult for the Trump administration, I believe, to say that socialism is to blame for Venezuela's crisis. It is a mixed economy. There's socialism and there's also free market capitalism, but it's sanctions, U.S. sanctions, which are causing Venezuela's woes here. And so I think we should keep that in mind when we hear this word. And I think much of this also has to do with Trump's own domestic fight he sees against Bernie Sanders, who could potentially rise to become the nominee of the Democratic Party, and then socialism will become a center in the national campaign in 2020.
That's a really good point, how it's being used for domestic purposes. And certainly there's a lot of energy in Congress from people who are calling themselves socialists now too. I would just point out that also there really is a version of this in Alaska where Alaskan residents are paid a monthly amount, and that's based on the oil that's pumped out of Alaska. So it really isn't as foreign to us. And even if a lot of Americans, even libertarians, don't like the system as it exists there, we have to understand that change is evolutionary. And if we wanted them to adopt a different kind of system, and maybe a better, more efficient system, the way to do it is not through sanctions and economic warfare. It's through trade and friendship.
Right. So. That's absolutely true. Whether you agree with Venezuela's system or not, the question is whether we believe in the basic principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and self-determination. The founding principles of the UN criticize that organization as much as you want, but those principles seem like a pretty good start for any basic international relations, because without them, it's any ability to conduct diplomacy is completely lost. You have to be able to recognize the ability of a sovereign country to decide its leadership, and that's what the Trump administration has thrown out the window with its recognition of Guaido. And that's why, for example, you mentioned the IMF vote. IMF executives voted this week not to recognize Juan Guaido as president. I don't think that's because they don't like him. They would love to see him take over Venezuela, because some of his advisors, such as Harvard professor Ricardo Hausman, are some of the IMF's best friends, people who were working in Venezuela before Chavez and implementing IMF policy, but they didn't vote to elect or to recognize Guaido because he has no power. His ambassadors don't have any authority in Venezuela. They're essentially playing government the way I used to play house as a young child.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly true. Well, we could probably go on for another hour on this, Anya, and it's a fascinating topic. There's so much more to uncover on Venezuela. I'd love to have you back on and talk about more, but I think we've exceeded our time now, so I think we need to sign off. So thanks so much for joining us, Anya.
It was my pleasure, Daniel, and I look forward to speaking again soon.
Thanks, and I would like to thank our audience for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.